Hi everyone. The interview you're about to see was recorded before the Winter Olympics and before the controversy that surrounded Kamila Valieva, the 15-year-old Russian skater who was found to have failed a drug test whilst in competition. An odd decision by the Court for Arbitration for Sport allowed her to continue to compete because she was a minor, i.e. under 18, stating that would cause psychological damage for her not to be allowed to compete. However, after being on the front page of every newspaper across the globe, the pressure was simply too much, and she collapsed, metaphorically, during her final performance and failed to win a medal. The behaviour of her coach when she came off the ice has raised many questions about how young women in particular are treated in elite sport. In the interview that follows, we address some of those questions and ultimately ask if it's time to place an age limit of 18 on all elite sport to protect young people, to protect them from abuse, to allow them to enjoy their childhood, and to not end up hating the sport they once loved. I hope that you will find the following interview both thought-provoking and challenging. So, hello and welcome to Edgehill University's International Women's Day 2022 events. I'm Professor Jo Crotty and I'm Director of the Institute for Social Responsibility at Edgehill University. ISR, as we call it, was set up in 2019 to support and engage in research that encapsulates the broadest conceptualizations of social responsibility. Part of that mission has been public engagement in related areas, including the promotion of women and other underrepresented groups. To mark this year's International Women's Day, we are looking at women who've had greatness thrust upon them, women who by accident, happenstance, or an event in their life that they would never have chosen has turned them into a campaigner, advocate, or even a politician. Joining me today is Dr. Mel Lang. Mel is a reader in social sciences at Edgehill University. She is also the current ISR Fellow and Associate Director of the Centre for Protection and Safeguarding in Sport. So let me introduce our first guest. In 2016, an unassuming woman did a remarkable thing. She went public with allegations of sexual abuse perpetrated by Larry Nassar, the team doctor for USA Gymnastics. In so doing, she opened a veritable Pandora's box that led to more than 500 women and girls coming forward with similar experiences, including four-time Olympic gold medalist Simone Biles. This led to high-profile resignations within USA Gymnastics and its eventual bankruptcy. It also led to criminal prosecutions of those who sought to cover up Nassar's behaviour within USAG coaching structure and the University of Michigan, where he was on staff, and multi-million-dollar payouts to victims from USAG and the University of Michigan. Nassar is serving an effective life sentence in prison without parole. This woman is Rachael Denhollander. Originally from a small town called Kalamazoo, she worked part-time and her mother cleaned the local gym so she could pursue her goal of being a gymnast. In seeking to prolong her gymnastics career, she sought out a doctor to treat long-term injuries. That doctor was Larry Nassar. Like many who've gone before and since, Nassar used his high profile as the doctor assigned to the USAG Olympic team and his charity work as a cover for his abuse. Young women and girls would not challenge the legitimacy of his so-called treatments because he was the best. This also extended to the girls' parents who were often present when the abuse was taking place. Yet on the day Rachael realised that these treatments were not legitimate, Nassar stopped treating her. 16 years later, with her disclosure, she would bring him and the structure around USAG crashing down. Today, Rachael is a lawyer and a survivor's advocate, and she joins us to discuss her remarkable story. So welcome, Rachael, and it is a real honour to meet you.
Thank you so much. I've really been looking forward to this conversation.
Okay, good. Me too. So we're going to go straight into it with the first question. So in your book, you describe the lengths you went to not to disclose or even give a hint to anyone that you've been abused. Yet when you read the original interview in the Indy Star accusing Nassar of these terrible crimes, you then decided to become the public face, the test case, disclosing in detail to strangers, to practitioners while you were on the phone pushing a trolley around the supermarket, on national television, and you even constructed your own legal case against your abuser. So could you tell us why you decided to disclose? What changed?
Yeah, so that's a fascinating question. And it's one of the most common questions I get asked because I think there's somewhat of a misconception with survivors that they just don't ever want to disclose. And that certainly is what it appears on the surface at my case too. But it wasn't that I wasn't willing to disclose, it was that I had no safe place to disclose to. So the question isn't so much how do we make survivors willing to disclose? The question really is how do we create cultures and systems and structures where they are safe to disclose? I was always willing to disclose, but I had no place to disclose to. And when that IndyStar article ran, that was the first hope I ever saw of being believed. At 17, my mom and I had actually talked about going down to the newsroom when I started to figure out what Nassar was doing and get an idea of how deep that abuse went. I knew I wasn't going to be the first, and I knew I wasn't going to be the last. And so the question became, what do we do with this information? And at that point in time, I was very confident of a couple of things. I knew enough about the dynamics of abuse to be sure that he was doing this regularly. His movements were very rehearsed. And when you have someone who is a serial perpetrator, it is almost never the case that there haven't been red flags and direct warnings. So by the time I realized what Nassar was doing, my rationale had started with, clearly he's doing this regularly. There's no way someone hasn't described what he's doing. The fact that he's here treating me means that this must be legitimate, because surely any adult or authority figure who heard a description from a child of what he was doing would check to make sure he had the proper certification for pelvic floor therapy and that this really was pelvic floor therapy. And so I trusted the systems and I trusted the people around me. When I began to realize that I was wrong on that final point, that surely the authority figures would do the right thing, what I realized was he is doing this regularly. He is abusing regularly. There is no way that people haven't described it. This means that whoever is coming forward and talking about it is being systematically silenced. And so I felt like there was just absolutely nothing I could do. And when I talked to my mom at 17, I said, I can't do anything without media pressure. One anonymous voice is never going to be enough. So we talked about actually going down to the newsroom and seeing if we could get them to run a story just to try to take control of the narrative from Larry and from the institutions that I was confident were surrounding and shielding him. But journalism was so different back then. And at 17, I didn't know how to navigate those waters and make that happen. So really what I was waiting for 16 years wasn't the willingness to speak up, but the ability to speak up.
It's really interesting about having to have that space. You do speak in the book about that conversation you had with your mother, and you both just conclude no one would believe you.
Yeah, so, there's nothing that we can do. The statistics on being able to stop a perpetrator when you report to the police are incredibly discouraging. It changes a little bit every year, of course, but on average, here in the US, for every 500 rapes reported to the police, or every 300 rapes reported to the police, only 5 to 6 are going to result in criminal charges and jail time. And then the average length of that jail sentence, should you be one of the very rare statistical anomalies who actually gets a conviction in jail time, the average length of that jail sentence is often less than the average length of a jail sentence for possessing a controlled substance. You can rape a child and do less jail time than if you have marijuana in your back pocket. And so when you realize that you are fighting a system like this and that you only have one chance, because that was a big part of my concern, is if I come forward and I don't succeed, Larry is going to be empowered to know he can't be caught, and then I don't have a chance later on. There's nothing I can do. And so I didn't want to come forward until I had the best shot possible at making it stick. And one anonymous voice was never going to be enough. Never.
I think Mel wants to follow that up now with the next question, perhaps on the broader context.
Absolutely, and I think that idea of what you talked about, the safe spaces and the system that you're working, you're fighting against, I think that's going to come up later on as well in our questions. So I'm going to ask about Joe's introduction there, and you are most well known for being a survivor advocate of child sexual abuse. But some of the context that allowed Nassar and other abusers to abuse athletes, it isn't only sexual abuse, and I think it's very often quite difficult to separate the emotional, physical, sexual abuse out. It's rare that these things occur on their own. And I think that that sort of physical, psychological, emotional abuse, as we refer to it in the UK, often is very driven by a sort of medals at all and at any cost approach. And in particular, I think that there's a lack of understanding for people who either aren't involved in sport at an elite level, or perhaps aren't involved in sport at all. There's a lack of understanding of the psychological, emotional, and to a lesser extent, but the physical abuse as well. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that.
Nassar was very much a product of the system he was in. We all want to think of pedophiles and child abusers as bad apples. And they're anomalies, but they're really not. They're products of the system that they are in. Now, I was a rarity in that the gym I was in was very healthy. My coaches were very healthy. I came from a very healthy family background. But the reality is that Nassar, and especially all of these sexually abusive coaches that we now know, were not operating in isolation. They were operating in a system that was so structured on authority and hierarchy and a win at all cost type of approach that it created the perfect storm. It normalized unhealthy and abusive behaviors verbally, physically, emotionally. And when you have shifted that perception of what normal is on a verbal and an emotional and a psychological level, you have created a breeding ground for reversing your perception of what normal is from a sexual contact standpoint. Yeah, and gymnastics is a sport where you are very reliant on the physical contact with your coaches. They have to spot you and reposition your body. And if you don't allow them to do that, you're not safe. But a lot of those coaches do that within a system where the victim has no voice. She has no ability to speak up. She is expected to portray unconditional obedience to whatever she is told to do. And then she is so broken down by the constant psychological and emotional abuse, and her own perception of her own reality is so broken down that the ability to define normal in any context is just completely lost. Yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of parents really suffer from this as well. And there's always that question of, well, where are the parents? How could they let this happen to their children? And in the case of Larry and sexual abuse, most of the time, the parents really had absolutely no idea what he was doing because he was so skilled at hiding it. But of course, the kids didn't know that. I didn't realize my mom couldn't tell what he was doing, so I didn't even know I needed to describe it to her. She was right there. Of course she could tell. Right? But when it comes to even the abusive structures in gymnastics, the psychological abuse, the verbal abuse, the emotional abuse, first, we have a consistent pattern of separating children from their parents so that parents are not actually observing what's going on in the gym. But to a young child who views their parent almost as all-knowing, it's inconceivable that their parents might not know. Most of the time, kids don't even know that they need to describe those things because in their frame of reference, it's just assumed that the adults in their life are aware of what's going on in their life. But when you have a system separating parents from children, it creates a breeding ground for parents to really not have any idea what's going on. And we very much have that. And then you also have a system that has conditioned the parents to believe this is what's normal. This is how sports and athletics must be done. This is in the best interest of your daughter. You know your daughter's dreams. If you speak up, you're going to get in the way of your daughter's dreams. And it creates this cycle where the parents and the child have poured so much into achieving those dreams that the parents are afraid to rock the boat if they do find something is going on because they know that it can cost their child everything they've worked for, and they love their child and they don't want to harm them. And so even reshaping how we as parents think about and engage with those systems is really critical, but so is reshaping those systems, because most of the time right now in gymnastics and in many other sports, it really is a choice between being able to pursue the sport that you love and having to completely walk away from it. You cannot compete in gymnastics outside of USAG and expect to go anywhere in that sport. You have to be certified through their program. And so reforming a parent's understanding and a parent's approach to athletics and a child's understanding and a child's approach to athletics is critical. But reforming those systems that have complete control over all of these dynamics is also absolutely critical. It's got to be a very multifaceted approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think really, there's so much to go on there. But if you had sort of one tip then for parents, would you be able to to offer one particular tip for parents, what do you want parents to know about the culture of sport and the different forms of abuse that happen there?
It'd be hard to pick one thing, but I can pick a dynamic. There were a couple of things that my parents did that were incredibly impactful in my life and gave me an open door to know that I could speak about what I had been through and that I would be believed and supported and protected. My parents started off very early by letting me know, they were not going to walk away. They were not going to pick a gym that was intentionally isolating parents from children. So if a gym had a policy of the athletes having to travel by themselves or stay in hotels by themselves, my parents just up front said, you are not going to be part of that gym. It is not worth the risk to your physical, mental, and emotional safety to take part in that. And so it just wasn't even on the table that we could. And the way it was communicated to me was, you are worth more than that. We are not willing to take that risk with your safety. So they were very intentional about the facility that they chose and how they engaged with that facility. And then they also had conversations with me from the very beginning before I was even enrolled in classes. What's going to happen if we start seeing you feeling pressure to make your body look a certain way? If we see you not eating in a healthy way? If we see your mental health being affected negatively, if we are observing abusive or unhealthy behaviors with your coaches, what's going to happen in that context? Here's what's going to happen. We're going to have your butt out of that gym so fast that you're not going to know what hit you. And my mom just flat out said to me, and I know you'll be angry, and I know that will be really hard, but I'm going to tell you right now, you are so much more important than anything you might accomplish in a sport, and I love you way too much to not risk your anger to keep you safe. So we went into athletics with that paradigm. And that also, what that really communicated to me was, my value's not in the sport. And my parents know my value's not in the sport. My parents are going to protect me. They are going to care for me. And if I speak up, they're going to believe me. So it gave me a safety net when I did experience abuse and a much healthier framework to fall back on. And I cannot overstate the importance of that for someone that has suffered trauma, to have that safety net and that place to fall back on and to reorient yourself to what's normal and healthy and acceptable behavior. When you have that framework, it so dramatically minimizes the impact of abuse.
Yeah, brilliant answer. And it shows just how important the parents being aware of the context is as well as the athlete. Yeah. Can I sort of move on now to think, I'm very struck by your position as someone who has been through the legal and the criminal system as a survivor, and also you're now an attorney working in that system. And we hear, so you've kind of seen it from both sides, and we hear a lot, and you mentioned earlier about victim blaming and how the criminal and the legal system isn't supportive of people who are disclosing. I think, have you got any suggestions, any ideas for how we can change that culture to make these systems more victim or survivor centric?
So many. It was incredibly eye-opening for me to be an attorney on the other side of the justice system, because I navigated both the criminal justice system and the civil justice system, and I navigated both of them as a survivor. And one of the things that really struck me throughout the entire process was the vulnerability of being in that position, because especially in the criminal process, you really are at the mercy of the justice system. You don't get to pick in the United States. You don't get to pick your prosecutor. You don't get to pick your detective. You have little to no input on what charges are going to be filed and how the case is going to be argued, and whether or not they're going to pursue investigation rapidly and do it the right way. And so, the biggest thing I was afraid of the entire time was not speaking up about Larry because of Larry. It wasn't even the cultural or the societal response that I knew I was going to receive. My biggest fear in speaking up was what detective I was going to get and what prosecutor I was going to get, because that's where it typically falls apart. And I knew that the most likely outcome is that the way the investigation would be conducted would be deeply re-traumatizing and not skilled at best. And I was incredibly blessed to have the opposite experience. I had a phenomenal detective and a phenomenal prosecutor, but the lack of training in our justice system, both for investigators and prosecutors, is just shocking. This does not work like SVU, Law and Order SVU. The lack of training is astonishing. The lack of financial resources to be able to fund those departments and procure the training and be able to process information and process affidavits and all of the things that you need to do, significant lack of funding. A lack of victim care. So it's very uncommon to have a department that has a victim advocate. This means that a lot of times survivors will go months having no idea what's happening in their case. Nobody's communicating with them. They've relinquished full control of the most sensitive and difficult portions of their life to a complete stranger. And then they have no voice and no input and no communication coming from that person. Your entire life is on hold and you have no say in that process. And that loss of voice is something that survivors experience in abuse. You lose your agency, you lose your voice. And engaging with the criminal justice system really is a choice to choose to re-lose those things again. So better training, better funding, and better accountability mechanisms. The reality is that the vast majority of law enforcement officers don't handle this well. And we see this put on full blast in the Nassar case. There were 5 different law enforcement agencies that received reports of Larry's abuse. Only one did the right thing. Only one. We had a mixture of absolute incompetence, not even opening proper police files, not doing proper investigations, not interviewing the witnesses that they needed to interview. And then we also had a mixture of outright corruption. Law enforcement officers that went whining and dining with the president of USAG and entertained job offers instead of investigating Larry. And in the amount of time it took these corrupt law enforcement officials to do absolutely nothing, the one detective and prosecutor who did it right had a conviction and a life sentence in the same amount of time. It's not that we can't do this well. It's that we don't prioritize doing this well. And that's a question of funding, it's a question of training, and it's a question of how far are we willing to go to have accountability mechanisms in place so that when you have corrupt law enforcement officials, there's a way to actually hold them accountable for it. Right now, we don't have those mechanisms in place, so there's no impetus to do the right thing, and there's no impetus for prosecutors' offices or police departments to let go those agents who are not doing the right thing. There's no motivation to do the right thing right now.
Wow. Yeah. Horrifying. Yeah.
It is.
I think that goes to an example you gave in your book where a young girl that she'd come to give her evidence and the judge stopped her evidence halfway through and she then had to come back at a completely separate time. And she'd, of course, psychologically prepared herself to give the evidence. She'd given half of it and then the case was adjourned. And then she'd had to go and redo all of that again. I hadn't thought about it until you described that in the book as to just how she would have had to have psyched herself up a second time to deliver that evidence. And it just seemed that everything was placed on the defendant and not on the witnesses or the victims giving the evidence.
Yeah, there are no victim protections, little to no victim protections in place. And there's so much that's left at the discretion of the judge. And then you have judges who are not trained and have no mechanisms of accountability. And it just creates this system where survivors are experiencing such deep re-traumatization, such a deep loss of agency and voice when they come forward, and for little to no tangible benefit. You are still recovering from the trauma of trial by the time your abuser is out, if you are even one of the lucky ones who manages to get a conviction, which is a massive statistical anomaly. And so the result that we got in the Nassar case is very possible to achieve if you do the right thing and you are well trained and you're passionate about pursuing these cases and you're willing to argue the law creatively. That result is absolutely possible to reach. But it's not statistically likely to reach because we don't often have detectives and prosecutors who are as skilled and as passionate about doing the right thing. And then it also does require rethinking our concept of what the justice system is for. We got a lot of pushback from certain quadrants on the 2 judges in Nassar's case, Judge Aquilina in Ingham County and then the judge in Eaton County, both allowed all survivors to speak. And that was a request that was made by the Assistant Attorney General. She said, I'm not going to do a plea deal unless the judges sign off on this. And so she secured everyone's right to speak and the judges allowed it. But oftentimes we don't think of justice in any kind of restorative fashion. And most of the time we think of our criminal justice system more as just a societal alarm bell. Hey, we don't like this conduct, so we're not going to allow this to happen. And it's not survivor focused at all. There's really not a question of how do we restore to the survivor part of what's been lost. But what we really saw in the Nassar case was a detective and investigators and judges who had a much more robust concept of justice. And so part of their framework was not just sending that societal message, not just stopping an abuser, but also looking at what are the restorative mechanisms in our justice system. Well, part of that can be restoring agency and restoring voice. So we're going to open the courtroom to allow all survivors to speak. But we did receive a fair amount of pushback for that from some quadrants of the legal community, calling it theatrical show and things like that. And that really takes a retraining in our legal system and of attorneys and judges as to what justice really should look like and why those mechanisms are appropriate to engage. And then, of course, also how to engage them in ways that don't compromise the legitimacy of the investigation in the case. It takes a complete framework and paradigm shift.
Those witness impact statements are so powerful. For those of you going to watch this interview, you can see some of that in the documentary At the Heart of Gold. They are really powerful, including your own. And on that, actually, I wanted to ask you a specific question, because you yourself, throughout your book and during those witness impact statements, the other survivors continue to call him Larry. And this started to really jar with me. Why not call him Dr. Nassar, or even more appropriately, Mr. Nassar, as he'd been struck off at that point, to put some distance between you and him, or not use his name at all? Can you explain that? Why you still
absolutely.
First name? Yeah.
So there are some survivors that have chosen to put that distance and to not use Larry's name again. We didn't use doctor because, of course, he'd been stripped of his title at that point in time. So that was quite intentional. But he was Larry to us. He was. That was the relationship that we had with him. And one of the things that survivors experience a lot of times is this disorientation between who this person is supposed to be and the relationship you thought you had with them and who they actually are. And to be able to make that adjustment and to wrap your mind around the reality that you don't actually have the relationship you thought you had with this person, and he's not who you thought he was. Most survivors don't make that leap very quickly, especially childhood survivors. But part of the reason that I continue to call him Larry is because that is what he was. And part of what we need to grapple with is how abusers operate. And the close relationships that they often groom with their victims and with the community that surrounds him. He was Larry to me for 16 years. He doesn't stop being Larry just because I've realized what he's done. And sometimes that element of jarring is actually really important from a societal and a cultural perspective. We need to be jarred by the level of close relationship that these families and these little girls had with Larry, that I had with Larry. Because that's how he was able to do what he did. And so there is an element in which I continue to use that because I want to remind people, this is the type of relationship I had with him. He was Larry to me. Because we have to grapple with those dynamics, and we have to understand them if we're going to be able to take disclosure seriously and to properly spot red flags and warning signs and grooming behaviors. We have to know what it looks like, and sometimes that jarring is necessary to get there.
Yeah, and I did find that jarring, but that made me think that, and the way that he complimented you on your boots all of the time, I found very jarring, in that he was trying to have a relationship with you that you can see as an adult is not okay. But as you said, when you're a child or a teenager, you just think it's flattering that he noticed them.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
I'm gonna hand back to Mel.
Yeah, so you're talking there, Rachael, about the culture of sport, aren't you? And I know one of the sort of, well, the first academic in the UK to highlight child sexual exploitation in sport, sadly now much missed, Celia Brackenridge. She talked about how sport was almost like a family, particularly when you're at that elite level, because you're spending so much time with these people. And again, that speaks to the culture of sport. I'm wondering, you know, there's been lots of tragic stories that have appeared in the media, including your own of the sexual and other forms of abuse that have happened in sport. And one of the things that keeps coming up repeatedly, sadly, is this failure to investigate. The people tried to speak out, as you mentioned at the start, the desire to disclose but nowhere to disclose. And I think, you know, these things keep happening for the similar stories for 10, 20 years worth of stories now. What do you think it is about the culture of sport that plays, you know, what is it, the role that sport plays in concealing abusers and silencing those that are affected?
You know, I actually don't think that it is a problem with sport. I think it is a problem with our identity and the natural human desire for community. You know, sexual abuse is something that crosses every socioeconomic barrier. It crosses every political spectrum, religious spectrum. It crosses everything. And while the flavors, if you will, of why we do things wrong shift a little bit depending on the community that you're involved in, there's a lot of very consistent threads that we see. This refusal to investigate, the silencing of victims, the shaming, the prioritization of something as greater than the survivors. That really boils down to the natural human desire to find community and relationship and identity. And so much of the time, we find our identity and our community in a shared goal, whether that is a shared religious goal, a shared political goal, a shared professional goal, a shared athletic goal. That's where we find our identity, our sense of value, our sense of belonging. And the reality is that most of the time, when we hear a disclosure of abuse within our community, the abuser is also someone within our community or is closely connected with someone in our community. So being able to hear that disclosure and act on it requires a substantial relational cost, because it means that this community where you have defined your sense of self and your sense of worth and your sense of identity, you now have to distance yourself from that community. You have to jeopardize your relationships with that community in order to speak up and protect the victim. You have to jeopardize the goals that you thought you had with that community. Again, whether that's a religious goal, a political goal, an athletic or a professional goal, you have to jeopardize what you thought you were aiming for and working for in order to speak up. And so what we're really talking about at the core is, where are you finding your sense of self? Where are you finding your sense of identity? How are you defining your own value and your own success and your own worth? Is your sense of identity rooted in doing what is right? Do you define success as being faithful with what you are given, or in reaching an artificial benchmark or community goal that you've set for yourself, a professional or a religious or a political goal? How are you defining success? How are you understanding your relationship in the community around you? Is your allegiance to a community, or is your allegiance to what is right? And when we start asking those questions, that's when you start unmasking why we are so consistently getting this wrong, regardless of the type of spectrum or community we're engaged in. Because those dynamics are really very, very consistent, regardless of whether we're looking at athletics or religion or our physical communities, our professional communities. It's very consistent dynamics, and it boils down to how we're finding our own identity and our sense of worth, and whether or not we're willing to jeopardize how we found that identity and sense of worth. And speaking up always comes with a cost, always.
And you know, those questions are so potentially disruptive of those communities. It's
absolutely.
Over to you, Jo.
Well, going back to perhaps more of our theme on the idea of our International Women's Day activities this year, Time magazine listed you as one of their 100 most influential people in 2018. People often mention you in the same sentence as Hillary Rodham Clinton, Billie Jean King, UK academic, Professor Mary Beard, as real trailblazers, female trailblazers. But the difference, I think, between you and them is that they were always going to be trailblazers, and you became one accidentally or unintentionally. Does this sit lightly with you, or do you feel that there's a weight of responsibility that comes with that? And if you do, how do you deal with it?
Yeah, making the choice to transition from advocacy in my own case to full-time advocacy was something we did weigh very carefully. Because again, I knew it would come with a cost. It has continued to come with relational and community costs. It comes with a cost to my children and to my husband and to my parents. You know, there's an entire group of people that pay the price when you choose to speak up and to continue speaking up. So it was not a decision we made lightly. At the same time, it is better to be able to do something about the evil in this world than to not be able to do anything at all. And for a very long time, there was very little that I could do. And so some of the most meaningful moments to me have come just from actually being able to advocate even for survivors outside of my own case in the religious or the political sphere or other athletics. I had an opportunity to advocate on an issue that was taking place in evangelicalism. And I had a mom reach out to me, and her children had all been abused over a decade ago. She reached out after she saw me speak about their case, and she said, I thought everybody forgot about us. I thought we didn't matter anymore. And just to be able to communicate to that mom and those kids, you still matter, and I haven't forgotten, and there are still people standing in the trenches with you, that just meant everything to me. But it is an incredibly weighty thing, because you're immersed in the trauma and the ugliness of what's going on in the world all the time. And it's so much easier to not see those things. It's a privilege to not be able to see those things. And there are a lot of us that can live in that privilege if we choose to pull back and just have the nice little house and the white picket fence and the 9-to-5 job and the cute little packaged family. It's easy to pull back and to not see, but it's a privilege to not see. And a lot of other people don't have that privilege. And the only way that we start purchasing that privilege, that freedom for everyone else, is for all of us to become equally invested in the fight. And so we did make that choice to transition into full-time advocacy. But I think the biggest thing for myself and for the family in general in terms of staying grounded is still that quintessential question of what is my identity? Where does my value come from? And how am I defining success? You know, if I define success as I'm going to make child abuse a non-existent factor, I'm going to stop rape. Those are all really laudable, worthy goals, but they're not goals that are going to be achieved in my lifetime. As much as I would love to say I'm going to make child abuse no longer happen, that's not going to happen. So if I set my sense of self and identity and success in an artificial human benchmark that I can't achieve, it really creates two problems. It creates the temptation to adopt an end justifies the means approach. It doesn't matter how I do it if I can just get closer to that goal, or it doesn't matter the compromise that I might have to engage in to try to get to that goal. If I can just do enough good things when I get there, I can erase everything I had to do to buy my way to that goal. An end justifies the means approach. And that's a very dangerous place to go. But it can be very tempting to go there if you think you can do enough good by buying your way there through compromise. Or it can tempt you to become very burned out, to look at all of the effort being put into reaching this very good goal of ending child abuse or ending rape culture, and realize that you don't look sometimes like you're making progress. And everybody who's involved in the advocacy realm has those days where you are just pouring out and you don't see any of the fruits of your labor. All you can see is the long road yet to go and the amount of damage that's still left. And then it can tempt you to start asking, why even bother? Why put the time and the effort into it? And so you can either become burned out or adopt an end justifies the means approach if your value and your identity and your definition of success is not accurate. And so for me, I think a better definition of success is being faithful with what you're given. And there are some days that I am given primarily teaching my children and loving the people well who are right in front of me. And there are other days that I'm speaking to thousands. And my job is to be faithful with what I'm given, to be able to go to bed at night and know that I have done the best I can. I've been faithful with what I've been given. And when you define success that way, and your identity is in doing what is right, rather than placating a particular community or reaching a particular goal, it helps steer away from either moral compromise or burnout. It's really the same quintessential questions that are at the heart of every discussion. Who am I? Where is my identity? Where is my value? And how am I defining success?
So you don't feel do you feel a burden that other young women might see you as I hesitate to use the word hero, but as somebody that they would aspire to be? Do you wear that lightly, or are you very conscious of that?
I think that's something we all have to take incredibly seriously. Yeah, and again, all of us have a sphere of influence, and I am acutely aware that my sphere of influence has grown so much more than I ever anticipated it to be, and just the importance of stewarding that well. But that was something that my parents really emphasized to me at a very young age, is that you always have a sphere of influence, and you never know the ripple down effects that your behavior and your choices and your attitude and your actions can have on those around you. And so I think having that approach, that being cognizant of the impact that you have on others and the way that your behavior impacts the community around you, already having that approach makes it a more natural transition to stepping into a role that has a bigger sphere than I had anticipated following. So yes, I feel it very heavily, but I think that's something all of us should feel. We all have children in our lives looking up to us who are shaped by the way we behave and the way we treat them. We ought to feel that, because damaging one child is a very serious thing. And to not feel that weight, I think, is inaccurate, no matter how big your sphere is.
Yeah, I think you're right. Final question for you. In your book, I really smiled when you described begging your parents to let you stay up for the 1996 Olympics all-around gymnastics competition. I mean, it's a home Olympics, right? We have one of those as well. It's a great thing. And it also really reminded me of begging my parents to let me stay up to watch Live Aid, which might have been before you were born. Gymnastics is also one of the few sports where the women are the stars. People know the women, they don't know the men. And so I wondered, do you still love it, or is it forever tainted for you now?
You know, there is a bit of both. I was very fortunate to have an incredibly healthy experience in the gym. And a lot of who I am today really was shaped by the lessons I learned in the gym. You know, I didn't start till I was almost 12, so I was not a little girl in a pretty box. I was a tall, gangly, almost teenager who was the worst on my competitive team, and I did not look cute doing it. Okay, so I had to learn from a very young age in that process to not care what other people said, because I didn't always get the nicest comments. I had to learn that success was doing the best I could. Success was not ever going to be the best, because I was never going to be the best. But finding delight and joy in hard work and in diligence. You know, I had to learn that it was okay to learn from kids who were younger than me. I had a lot of teammates who were years younger than I was, but they were more skilled than I was. And so to be able to go to them and be like, hey, help me out on this, I'm not getting it. And to be able to have an attitude of learning and an attitude of humility, that was an incredibly important life lesson. Learning where I found my identity and my value, and that it wasn't in my athletic success. Learning to have delight and joy in hard work and in doing the best I could, and to see the progress even when I was still the worst on the team, no matter I worked for months and I saw absolute, beautiful progress, and I was still the worst on the team at the end of the progress. And so to feel the success at that, those are such incredibly important life lessons. And it really reshaped how I approached coaching when I transitioned to coaching, how I engaged with my athletes, and really focusing on the life lessons that they were going to take from the sport. I think there are incredibly beautiful things you can take from that sport. I loved the command it gave me over my own body. The feeling of being very strong and flexible and knowing where your body was in time and space. It just made life very easy. And so even on a physical level, I loved what I learned from the sport. That being said, I've also had to grapple with how unique my experience is, and how many other gymnasts don't have that experience, and how normalized the abusive behavior was. And so my perspective on it has wildly shifted, because I look back at all of these memories that I had as a gymnast, and I realized what was going on behind the scenes. And that's a lot to carry, and looking at some of the gymnasts that are even competing now and knowing what's actually going on in their gym and how unhealthy so many of the current coaches still are. So it's really a both and. I love the sport. I love what you can learn from it, but I definitely feel and carry the weight of how abusive and dysfunctional it so often is. And I can't unsee those things. I also wouldn't want to unsee those things. You need to be able to bear witness to the pain and the trauma and the grief and the dysfunction if you're going to stand with survivors and change it. So I wouldn't change having seen those things now.
Well, Rachael, we really want to thank you for your time today and your insightful answers and the wisdom that comes with those answers as well. It's really absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure that people, having listened to you, probably now want to go and find out more. So if you are interested in finding out more, you can read Rachael's book, which is called What a Girl's Worth. There are also 2 documentaries you can watch in the United Kingdom, one called At the Heart of Gold, which is on Sky Documentaries, the other one called Athlete A, which is on Netflix. And there are a number of interviews, including one with Ali Reisman on BBC Sounds. Again, Rachael, I really want to thank you so much for your participation today. And I wish you all the luck in the world with your work and your advocacy. And even if you move the dial this much, then you definitely would have changed something for the better. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Truly my
Thank
privilege.
you.
I'm really grateful you held space for the conversation.
Thanks very much.